Welcome to Chapter 1. Today we'll be talking about psychology and scientific thinking. So I think of this chapter as kind of a pretty brief introduction to psychology, but I also think we'll be setting up some of those larger foundations of the rest of the course, especially during our discussions of scientific thinking. One of our goals in PSY2012 is to ensure that the students come out of the class as being more critical consumers of science and more critical consumers of media in general and media about science. So our discussions of scientific thinking will be important for the rest of the course, and we'll return to them quite a bit. So our learning objectives for today: first, we'll define and describe the study of psychology. We'll introduce psychology as a science. We'll discuss biases and how scientists overcome them. We'll describe the scientific method. We'll determine why common sense can be misleading. And we will review the evolution of early psychology. So first, we'll kind of open it up to that big question: what is psychology? So if this was an in-person class, as we all kind of, I think, hoped it would be, I would have posed this to the rest of the class, but since we can't do that, instead I'll discuss some of the common responses I've gotten to this question. One is assuming that psychology is just about therapy. I found that I actually have to, when I tell people what I do and what I study, I have to get in pretty fast to explain, like, oh, no, I'm not helping anybody. I do research on people, but I don't help people with their problems. It doesn't stop people from telling me their problems, but I'm not a professional. Then people also assume that maybe psychology is just the study of mental illness or psychological problems, but of course it's more broad than that. And then a response I've gotten in class before is students very broadly say psychology is the study of humanity. And of course that would then be too broad, because then archaeology, anthropology, sociology, they study humanity as well. And also sometimes in literature, maybe biologists study humans as well. So obviously that answer is too broad too. But the correct answer is that psychology is the scientific study of the mind, brain, and behavior, and then how all of those things interact with each other. So now we'll talk about different levels of analysis and how to analyze psychology at several different levels. And we do this because psychology is complex, right? We need to think about it from multiple perspectives in order to understand it fully. And each level of explanation tells us something different about the mind, brain, and behavior. So your textbook asks you to conceptualize these levels of analysis as a ladder, with biological mechanisms like brain functions, brain topography, chemical reactions within the brain, genetics, etc., as these kind of lower rungs of the ladder, these like base mechanisms again. And then the higher rungs of the ladder, these socio-cultural factors. So our social relationships, our cultural influences, things of that nature. But here is the example the book gives you. I'm moving my face. I'm obviously including my face so that it feels more personable, but I got to move myself around a little bit. So here's the book's explanation of depression at each level of these explanation. So we have the molecular level, again, these genetic factors. There's the neurological and physiological level, so different functionality of our brain structures, behavioral level, at social level, and I think they're missing, I think at the social level, they're including those larger social influences, including things like culture, socioeconomic background, etc. But to fully understand psychology, we do need to consider each one of these levels in turn. Genetic, social influences, biological factors, they're each insufficient on their own to fully understand all of human behavior. We need to consider each one and integrate them, again, to fully understand the mind, brain, and behavior. There are 5 challenges of psychology that make it a particularly difficult field of research to study. The first challenge is that actions are multiply determined. It's rare for there to be a single variable explanation of behavior. So let's take the example of success. If we were trying to figure out who would be successful versus who would not be successful, we might take a factor like hard work and use that as our explanation. But of course, hard work doesn't operate in a vacuum. People who are charismatic are also more likely to be successful. So are people who are more intelligent are more likely to be successful. And sadly, something like attractiveness or height also factors into success. But then, of course, something we cannot forget about is also apart from individual differences. So societal factors like socioeconomic status play maybe a larger role than individual differences. A person's access to a good diet and low stress in early childhood, better education, and also having had better connections to other successful people their entire lives also is a partial explanation for success. So again, if we were trying to study success, there wouldn't really be one factor that we would look at specifically as an explanation. All of those factors must be looked at together and integrated with one another. The second challenge is that there's a codependence of psychological influences. This means that multiple factors are often highly interrelated with one another. So the book uses anorexia as an example, and I recommend maybe reading that example as well, because the book does a good job of explaining it. But the example I'll give you today is something like ADHD. ADHD is highly related and comorbid to anxiety. But unfortunately, these two factors often kind of play with each other and make each other worse. So somebody who has ADHD, who might be more likely to procrastinate or forget about an assignment, is also going to have anxiety about forgetting that assignment or delaying it, or they're worried that they will do badly on it because they struggle in school. So then the anxiety makes someone less likely to start working on their assignment. So what this means is that if we try to decide why a student didn't finish their assignment at the time or wait until the last minute and then didn't do as good of a job on it, we couldn't necessarily say it was their ADHD or their anxiety because both of them played together. The anxiety influenced the ADHD and the ADHD influenced the anxiety. I am totally not speaking from experience here as an ADHD person. The third challenge of psychology is, of course, that there are individual differences between people. We vary wildly from each other, and we aren't all carbon copies of each other. And that's, of course, wonderful and one of the amazing things about the human species. But when it comes to studying what somebody might do in a given circumstance or situation, individual differences make it kind of hard to predict. So to return to my first example, if we consider two individuals who were both raised in similar circumstances, that they both had access to all the resources in the world, had the best education, the best connections, etc. One individual might end up being incredibly successful, might be a hard worker, give all sorts of money to charity, amazing stuff. And then another person might have access to all the resources in the world, and instead of pursuing success, they spend all their time, partying on yachts. Not that there's anything wrong with that, it sounds very nice, but if we're talking about predicting success, the individual differences are, of course, an important factor there, and it makes it difficult to predict different outcomes. The fourth challenge is reciprocal determinism. So this means that we mutually influence each other's behavior. So I really like the example that the book gave, the idea of the fact that an extrovert is somebody who enjoys going out and meeting new people and talking to people and generally likes people, so is pretty friendly to them. If you enjoy people and are nice to them and excited to see them, generally you're going to get positive feedback in return, and you're also probably going to want to spend more time with extroverts who react the same way to other people than maybe you would with an introvert. I'm saying this as a person with lots of introvert friends. But generally, your extroversion continues to be reinforced by the positive interactions you have with other people. So you are more likely to become more and more extroverted as you continue to have these positive interactions. So extroversion, of course, does not operate within a vacuum because other people are constantly influencing that behavior. The fifth challenge is the big one, cultural differences. So again, individuals vary with each other, but then societies and different cultures differ from one another in pretty large ways. So this is actually a huge problem in a lot of the social sciences, is that because the US is such a huge monolith for research, a lot of the research that's been done on human behavior has happened in a US context, and more specifically in a university context, where all of the undergrads end up being kind of lab rats for our research. But unfortunately, 18 to 22-year-old college students aren't really a good measure of the demographics of the rest of the world. So we can't really make large claims about human behavior based on a pretty narrow demographic representation. But it's also not even just the idea of undergrads versus the full spectrum of, human lifespan. Of course, also, we can't make claims about human behavior in just an American context, because different cultural contexts, of course, play a large role into human behavior. In psychology, we must abandon relying on opinions or straight intuition. Instead, we perform experiments to test a theory. Evidence can either support a theory or not, but we can never prove a theory. And this is something that I think will be really important for all of you to kind of take on in the rest of this class, and then probably in your other science classes as well, is to really just generally avoid the word prove. When we're talking about experiments, especially in this class, I probably won't dock points for using that word, but I will circle angrily if you use prove in your final paper. But then, of course, even though we can't prove theories, some theories are better supported than others. So Darwinian evolution is an example of a well-supported theory. And of course, so is something like climate change. Of course, we cannot prove necessarily that climate change is because of human behavior. But with the overwhelming evidence, it is reasonable for us to assume that, yes, climate change is happening, and yes, it is because of human action. So we should do something about that. That's one of my plugs for today. So bias is everywhere. Of course, it exists in science as well, but ideally, the scientific method is used to prevent bias. One example of bias is confirmation bias. So this is the tendency to seek out evidence that supports our hypothesis and to neglect contradicting evidence. So I think this is something that happens on the internet all the time, right? I follow people on Twitter who are more likely to agree with me than I am to follow people on Twitter who don't agree with me. Same thing with Reddit or Facebook. You're more likely to kind of pick and read the evidence that supports your opinions and your hypotheses than opinions that don't. Scientists, though, when designing a study, ideally will design a study that may disprove their theories or hypotheses to overcome confirmation bias. A scientist should never design a study in which their hypothesis is not falsifiable. Falsifiability is incredibly important when designing a study, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the chapter. Another type of bias is belief perseverance. So this is the tendency to stick to our initial beliefs even when evidence contradicts them. So I think a great example of this is, every few years or so, the study comes out that says that red wine is actually good for you. And people like to have a glass of red wine that night to celebrate that they're actually doing something healthy for themselves, something heart healthy. But of course, there's a lot more evidence that suggests that red wine probably doesn't do anything for you, and more likely alcohol is pretty detrimental to our health. But of course, that is not nearly as fun as red wine being good for you, so we're more likely to kind of stick to that initial belief that having a glass of red wine at night is ultimately good for your longevity, even though the evidence does seem to contradict that idea. One question that many social scientists get is, what about common sense? Is common sense a good enough explanation for human behavior? Are our gut intuitions often correct about how the world works? But of course, this is a problem because our common sense is frequently incorrect. Take, for example, the idea of safety in numbers. I think right now we could all agree that people aren't particularly safe in numbers, especially when it comes to a large-scale pandemic. Another issue with common sense is that our brain can be fooled relatively easily. So this is an important term for everyone to know, naive realism. This is the incorrect belief that we see the world for how it really is. And I'm going to include a good example of this that I recommend that everybody watch on something called change blindness, that people don't recognize that something in their environment has changed, and they wouldn't be able to tell you that something had changed. So they would think that they had a correct belief about how the world was, but in reality they did not. So I recommend watching that video for a good explanation of, or a good example of naive realism. Additionally, we don't notice contradictions in common sense until they are pointed out to us. For example, birds of a feather flock together and opposites attract are two common sayings when it comes to attraction and friendship, but of course they mean two entirely different things. Your textbook wants us to distinguish between science and metaphysical claims because metaphysical claims lie outside of the boundaries of science. Metaphysical claims are non-testable assertions that fall outside of the realm of science. This just means that they aren't testable or falsifiable. This doesn't mean that metaphysical claims are incorrect, just that they aren't scientific. So some examples are things like ghosts or the soul, and again, they may or may not exist, but we as scientists cannot test them or falsify their existence, and thus they don't really have a place in science. I'm sure somebody out there is trying to do some sort of study, but I can't imagine that that's going very well for them with their research. And I'm very sorry that my face is covering up this cute little cartoon. You can all view it later when you look at the lecture slides. A good scientist recognizes that they might be wrong. They have a prescription for humility. They are aware that they may be mistaken and don't try to prove their theories. It is obviously best to avoid definitive conclusions unless the evidence for a theory is overwhelming. And again, some theories have more evidence, some theories have less evidence. But again, it's important to have this humility in science. There are also scientists where that doesn't happen, and there's huge arguments and debates within the field, and some people won't back down on some claims, but hopefully all scientists are designing studies in a way that allow for them to gather evidence in a non-biased fashion. So now we'll discuss psychological pseudoscience, and we'll talk about this because it's really important to distinguish science from its imposters. Pseudoscience is a set of claims that seem scientific but are not, and they lack the safeguards against confirmation bias and belief perseverance. So some examples are things like astrology or telepathy, and this isn't psychological, but I see a lot of pseudoscience in products like essential oils or diet products or skincare products, and ultimately I think a lot of those unscientific claims that these products make are bad for your wallet. But with popular psychology, unfortunately, it's a really large industry that's continuously growing, and a lot of self-help books recommend techniques that have never been evaluated scientifically. So an example I'll give is, and I actually hear this a lot, is the idea that whenever you're angry, you should punch a pillow instead of having an outburst at another person. And I've seen this recommended in pop psych a lot. And the idea is that instead of hurting someone in your life with your words, you redirect that anger to an object that can't be hurt. But unfortunately, when that claim was evaluated scientifically, it turns out that people actually became more angry because they were finding a kind of positive a positive release for their anger, and it actually became a little addictive and made them more likely to be angry more often and thus less in control of their anger. It turns out that finding better coping mechanisms that could have been done in therapy, mechanisms that would have been evaluated scientifically would have been a much better method for people. But that idea of punching a pillow whenever you feel angry has persisted over methodologies that are better researched and have better support for actually being helpful for people. Ultimately, a claim like that has been damaging overall. Now we'll discuss warning signs of pseudoscience so that you, the student, can keep your eye out for pseudoscience in the wild. The first warning sign is an ad hoc immunizing hypothesis. So this is an escape hatch to protect against falsification. It's usually a loophole or an exception so that a person's claim can't be disproved. For example, psychics often claim that skepticism or energy can interfere with their psychic power. So when they are incorrect in something that they've envisioned, they can claim that someone was skeptical in the room or there was other energy that interfered with their power. And this, again, is an escape hatch to protect against falsification. Another example, unfortunately, Alcoholics Anonymous is a program that does a lot of good, but it is a program that is not based in science or results. And one of the problems with their belief system is that they claim that an addict can only get better through Alcoholics Anonymous if they fully give themselves to the program. So of course, anytime that Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't help, it ends up being the fault of the addict, not necessarily because statistically Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't necessarily have the best methodology for helping addicts. Again, it's one of the most diverse and easily accessible addiction recovery programs, but because they are not based in science, they instead use ad hoc immunizing hypotheses for why addicts may or may not get better through their program. Then there's a lack of self-correction. Again, this gets back to the belief perseverance that we talked about earlier. So whether or not a claim shifts based on new evidence. An over-reliance on anecdotes. So anecdotes don't really tell us about cause and effect. Anecdotes are difficult to verify. So often anecdotes are used with miracle cures. So this is something, unfortunately, I've seen a lot with anti-vaccination or essential oil claims that essential oils or other types of miracle cures helped my cousin's best friend's son, and that's why I'm not using them with my children. And unfortunately, again, they're difficult to verify. And because these claims haven't been evaluated scientifically, it's not really clear why little Johnny got better or he didn't get better. So here are some more warning signs of pseudoscience. These are in your textbook, and of course this will be accessible to you in the slides, so you can review these on your own time. So why are we drawn to pseudoscience? Why is pseudoscience so easily consumable? First is patternicity. This is the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in their absence. Our brains are predisposed to make order out of disorder and find sense in nonsense. And sometimes this can be adaptive, right? Finding patterns can be adaptive. So you eat a type of food twice and it makes you sick both times. You've seen a pattern there and you probably don't want to eat that food again. That's an adaptive function. But of course, this can sometimes lead us astray. So for something like betting, we often see patterns that don't really exist because for games of chance, it's of course based on chance, not based on patterns. This is really hard to kind of get your brain out of this mode where if you're flipping a coin, you will tell yourself, well, this time, there's been 3 heads in a row, this time it has to be tails. But of course, in reality, it does not have to be tails at all because every time the coin is flipped, it's a 50-50 shot. Additionally, we are drawn to pseudoscience because we find comfort in our beliefs. Pseudoscience often makes claims that are easy to understand, easy to believe in, and it's comforting to have, to kind of feel a sense of control over our surroundings. So what are the actual dangers of pseudoscience? I've given some examples like skincare products where at the end of the day, a wild claim like charcoal being beneficial, although not true, it doesn't really hurt you that skincare companies are now pushing charcoal. All it hurts really is your wallet because you're essentially buying an unnecessary product. But at the end of the day, there's not really a danger there. But of course, there are real dangers to certain pseudoscientific claims, including opportunity costs. So certain claims can lead people to forgo opportunities to seek effective treatments. Again, this is where miracle cures are incredibly dangerous because people, when they are sick, might not seek medical treatment because they're using a cure or a claim that doesn't really have any basis in medical reality. Unfortunately, Steve Jobs is an example of this. When he had terminal cancer, he sought out a medical cure or, if I'm remembering correctly, diet-based treatments. And ultimately, he did lose his battle with cancer when maybe if he had sought real medical treatment, that might not have happened. But I'm not a doctor, so I can't say for certain. But it is true that there was an opportunity cost in seeking out an effective treatment first. Unfortunately, some pseudoscientific claims cause real direct harm. So one example in your textbook is rebirthing therapy. So this was the idea that going through a rebirth would sort of cleanse a person of their traumas. But unfortunately, this therapy was really physical and dangerous, and they ended up asphyxiating their patients or injuring them, or ultimately some people passed away through this therapy that at no point in time had real evidence for its efficacy. So that's an incredibly sad example of how pseudoscience has real direct harm. On a smaller and less dangerous scale, something like a cleanse, and a lot of diet claims I've seen that are kind of peddled to young people are unhealthy. It is not healthy to drink a detox tea. It is not healthy to be on some sort of, really crazy keto-based diet. And the influencers on Instagram who are selling those to young people aren't selling them because they truly believe in giving themselves diarrhea through tea. Not to be crass, but that's what it does. They don't really believe in that. They're doing it because the tea and these companies actually give them money to sell it to you. And ultimately, it's generally not good to give yourself a cleanse. It's unhealthy. That's the end of that rant. Additionally, pseudoscience unfortunately creates a culture in which citizens can't think scientifically, and this is something that we see a lot on the internet, that incorrect pseudoscientific ideas spread like wildfire, and if we aren't seriously considering them and we aren't critically evaluating them, more dangerous types of pseudoscientific claims can get spread around easily too. Again, something like charcoal in your skincare, not dangerous, but it's not too far away from a cleanse, which can be dangerous. And that's also not too far away from other sorts of crazy, more extreme diets, which can be really damaging for a person. And of course, we should beware of scams that prey on your natural tendencies. And I'll link a video of psychic readings. So these are people who prey on those who are grieving and financially profit off of grief. So the main point of all of my, raging against skincare companies and diet companies is that if we learn to think scientifically, we can learn when we're supposed to trust our common sense and when we're not supposed to trust our common sense, and additionally, how to kind of distinguish pop psychology and pseudoscience from real science. So we'll get into scientific thinking. How are we actually supposed to do this? Again, learning to think scientifically can help us to avoid falling prey to things like pseudoscience. So first, some logical fallacies to avoid. The first one is the emotional reasoning fallacy. So this is when we use emotions to guide the validity of a claim. Again, I can use this example again. I'm more likely to believe that red wine is good for me because I really want to believe that, because that would make me much happier than if it turned out that red wine was bad for me. But we do know that my emotions and my feelings about red wine probably have nothing to do with the actual health benefits of it. Then there's the bandwagon fallacy. So if many people believe something, it must be correct. Again, I'll just keep reusing examples. A lot of people believe that punching your pillow when you're angry is a helpful displacement of your anger. And it turns out that that is probably not necessarily true. Then there's the not me fallacy. So this is thinking that you are exempt from errors and thinking that plague other people. Unfortunately, it's hard to avoid this fallacy. But again, it's important to recognize that we are as susceptible to claims and techniques as many other people. So we should all engage in scientific skepticism, which is an approach of evaluating all claims with an open mind, but insisting on persuasive evidence before accepting them. And when we engage in scientific thinking, we'll use a set of skills for evaluating claims in an open-minded and careful way. So if we want to be skilled as scientific thinkers, we should use these next 6 principles that I will discuss. And these 6 principles will be important for you to know. The first principle is ruling out rival hypotheses. So when there is a finding or a claim, it is important for important alternate explanations to have been considered. And if they haven't been considered, that's an indication that maybe you should be a little skeptical of the finding or the claim. The second principle of scientific thinking is falsifiability. If a claim cannot be reasonably disproven, that means we should probably be skeptical of it if the claim cannot be evaluated scientifically. Again, a psychic claiming that energies have something to do with their ability to use their psychic powers, that claim really can't be proven or disproven, and thus we should be really skeptical of their claim. Third, replicability. So can the results of a study be duplicated in other studies? So this is where, again, as a budding scientist, you should be pretty wary, because often the media will publish new findings and exciting findings, but sometimes those haven't been replicated at all, and thus we should be a little skeptical in accepting them before they've been duplicated by another study. Of course, then you get into all sorts of issues with publishing, but it's a little too early on to get into that discussion. The fourth principle is correlation versus causation. And this will be a really important principle for you to take on with you through this class and then outside of this class. Correlation is distinct from causation. For example, ice cream sales are correlated with murder. As more ice cream is sold, murder rates in the country also increase. So what that might mean, if we consider that correlations to be causations, would mean that ice cream sales are directly associated with murder. Maybe everyone is lactose intolerant and it makes them violent. So the ice cream consumption, the ice cream sales were actually causing the increase in murder. But of course, that is incredibly silly, and what it has more to do with, this correlation probably has more to do with an underlying third example, like the summer heat. People are buying more ice cream in the summers, and also murder rates tend to go up in the summer. The fifth principle is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So the more incredible a claim is, the kind of higher rigor we expect from the evidence. A good example of this is a scientist named Daryl Bem claimed that he found evidence of precognition, or basically psychic abilities, or ESP, that people were predicting stimuli before the stimuli actually appeared to them. And this was a pretty rigorous study that he did with over 1,000 participants and 9 different methods for evaluating this. But unfortunately, no one else has really been able to find evidence of his claim. So ultimately, there really isn't enough evidence to consider this kind of wacky claim. And again, this also ties into replicability, that Daryl Bem has consistently found what he considers to be precognition, but nobody else is. So there might be something going wrong with the way that he is conducting his studies. Claim is Occam's razor, or parsimony. This is the idea that a simpler explanation is more likely than a complex explanation. Again, in our first example, is it more likely that a large dairy cabal wreaking havoc, or is it likely, again, that everyone just turns out to be a little bit lactose intolerant, or is the simpler explanation that it was the summer heat and the increase in murders and the increase in ice cream in the summer? That simpler explanation is more likely to be true than those other complex explanations. Now we will transition a bit and discuss a very brief history of early psychology. We will discuss some of the ideas that are presented by these early psychologists later in the class as well, but for now we'll do kind of a very cursory overview. So early historical psychology used to involve a lot of common sense, as well as sitting back and reflecting. And this had close ties with philosophy more than the empirical research that we see conducted in psychology today. Again, it was more about asking those big questions about what makes someone human, what is the mind, how do we explain behavior, which of course we still ask today, but it was more about reflecting on those ideas than actually performing experiments and studies on them. But the first actual psychology lab was created by Wilhelm Wundt. So this lab utilized introspection, which was reflecting and reporting on one's mental processes. So this was kind of considered an early observational methodology. So Wundt trained his students to observe and report on their own thoughts and feelings in response to stimuli. But after Wilhelm Wundt, eventually 5 different frameworks of psychology emerged. So we'll discuss each of these frameworks in turn, and each one is associated with a major psychologist, and it will be important for you to know both the theoretical framework and the psychologist associated with them. The first is structuralism, then functionalism, behaviorism, cognitivism, and psychoanalysis. So the first great theoretical framework of psychology is structuralism, and the psychologist associated with structuralism is Edward Titchener. So Titchener adopted the same method from Wundt, this method of introspection. But his major goal, which was different from Wilhelm Wundt's, was that he wanted to create a map of the elements of consciousness. Again, this is where the name of the framework comes from. He wanted to map the structure of consciousness. So he wanted to include kind of where sensations, images, and feelings were kind of occurring in one's consciousness. The lasting influence of Titchener was really this emphasis of systematic observation to the study of the conscious experience. Again, it was really that focused on inward observation. But of course, I think you can all recognize at this point that of course there's some issues with that. First, introspection is subjective. Everyone has a different internal experience. Second, introspection is an incomplete view of what's going on in the mind, and we'll discuss this with a later framework, but we aren't necessarily aware of everything that is going on in our mind, and thus it is difficult to map it just from one person's report on its own. The next theoretical framework is functionalism, and the psychologist associated with functionalism is William James. So James wrote The Principles of Psychology, and he is also considered the founder of American psychology. He sought to understand the adaptive functions of concepts like thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and he was influenced by Darwin and natural selection. So James's kind of goal was to ask these big why questions. Why do we have the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we do, and what was the adaptive function of them, the evolutionary function of these thoughts and behaviors? A good example is something like anxiety, that feeling anxious in the modern world might not be particularly adaptive, but potentially when early hominids were evolving, it was helpful to have somebody who was anxious and extra prepared and on the lookout for threats. So having something like anxiety or nerves or pain, somebody who pays extra attention was functionally adaptive. So the lasting influence of functionalism is that it's actually still pretty prevalent in psychology today. We'll talk about this in some later slides, but we still have an entire area of psychology called evolutionary psychology, where we ask these types of questions. Are there adaptive evolutionary functions to some of the cognitive or psychological attributes that we have? The next great theoretical framework of psychology is behaviorism, and the psychologist associated with this is B.F. Skinner. And we will talk about behaviorism in much more depth when we get to the learning chapter. But B.F. Skinner really disagreed with introspection because he believed that we cannot see into the mind, and that as a scientist, we should just kind of observe and report on true observable behavior. He always likened the mind to a black box, and that we can only observe the input. So I hope you can see my little cursor here. So we can only observe the stimulus, and then we can observe the output, the behavior. And anything within the black box, which is the mind, we cannot actually observe. So again, he sought to understand human behavior solely through scientific observation and relying on no reports from the people in the studies about their internal processes. So B.F. Skinner has a lot of lasting influence. Again, we will discuss this influence much more specifically in the learning chapter, but he had incredibly influential models of animal and human learning. And again, that specific focus on observable research and objective research was critical with B.F. Skinner. And we still have, in the UF Department of Psychology, we still have a behavior analysis area. The next great theoretical framework is cognitivism, and the psychologist associated with cognitivism is Jean Piaget. So psychologists at a certain point grew tired of behaviorists' neglect of mental processes. Clearly, something is going on in the mind that happens between the stimulus and the behavior. So a cognitive psychologist argues that our thinking does, in fact, affect behavior. So a great example that you all will deal with is that students will, get the same grade, the same stimulus, and respond to the grade differently. So a student who typically gets A's gets a B, and it's upsetting. But a student who typically gets C's gets a B, and that's great news. It's the same grade, the same stimulus, but there was an interpretation there that created different behavior. And that was one of the key points of cognitivism, is that there are cognitive processes, and potentially we cannot observe them, but they exist, and they they kind of modify that link between stimulus and behavior. So cognitivism is still thriving today and has expanded into neuroscience. Again, we have a department, an area within psychology called the behavioral cognitive neuroscience. And I would say that I am a developmentalist, and I would consider myself a cognitive developmentalist. And we will talk a lot more in depth about Piaget when we get to the developmental chapter. But yes, cognitivism and Piaget's ideas are still thriving and popular today. The final great theoretical framework is psychoanalysis. And of course, I think this is probably the most famous psychologist, which is a little unfortunate. We will talk about Freud more in depth, but nobody really takes Freud seriously anymore, and it's one of those fun jokes in psychology. But Freud believed that our primary influences on our behavior were our unconscious drives, impulses, and thoughts. So these unconscious drives included things like sexuality and aggression, so that our behavior is influenced by sexuality and aggression all the time, even though that's unconscious and we may not be aware of it. Freud did emphasize the role of infant and childhood experience, and he believed that they got at the root of our internal conflicts. And I think that that is definitely true, but this idea of childhood experiences being, shaping the rest of your existence is still very prevalent today in pop psych. So of course, Sigmund Freud has a lot of lasting influence, but specifically his lasting influence within the field, the empirical field, is that the understanding that much of our mental processing happens without our conscious awareness. So a lot of his other, his id, ego, super ego stuff, again, we'll talk about that more specifically, that you might be familiar with, we don't take seriously anymore, but we definitely take seriously the idea of kind of unconscious mental processing. So now we'll kind of jump into modern psychology. So modern psychology is very diverse, and it covers kind of a wide variety of areas. There's about 500,000 psychologists worldwide, and they work in a variety of settings. So this is from your textbook. Obviously, the largest proportion of psychologists works in academia, right? They're professors, they're researchers. But then there's quite a few who work for themselves as counseling psychologists, or for companies, or for not-for-profits. There's a lot of psychologists working for the government, or within a school setting as well. So now we'll discuss the wide variety of different types of psychologists that are out there, just to give you an idea of the diversity of the field and the amount of different career paths that are out there. First is a clinical psychologist. So it's right in the name. Clinical psychologists work with clinical populations. So they work with patients who have clinical diagnoses like severe depression and anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, BPD, etc. So they're working with people with these kind of chronic mental health problems. Next is a counseling psychologist. So again, this is a type of psychologist that you're probably familiar with from the media. A counseling psychologist is what you would probably consider a therapist. They work in counseling, and the book emphasizes that they work with kind of in short-term capacities, but I don't think that's true. A lot of counseling psychologists develop pretty long-term relationships with their patients, but they aren't necessarily helping people with these kind of long-term chronic mental health problems. They're more helping people, work through their potentially more acute issues. These first two, I think, are the types of psychologists that people think of first when they think of psychology. Next is a school psychologist. So these are psychologists who work in school settings to help students. We actually have a school psychology program here at UF, but it is not through the psychology department. It is through the College of Education. Next is a developmental psychologist, and I'm not totally a fan of how the book describes this, but a developmental psychologist looks at how a human develops, whether that's physically, cognitively, emotionally, etc. So the book emphasizes the fact that developmental psychologists work with children, and while it's true that quite a few of us do, myself included, a lot of developmental psychologists also focus on the other side of the age spectrum, and they focus on even middle age or aging and the developmental changes that happen throughout the lifespan. And we'll talk more about that in the developmental psychology chapter. Next are experimental psychologists, and again, it's right in the name. They are psychologists who work in research settings, and they conduct experiments to answer those big questions. Next are biological psychologists. They examine the physiological processes or bases of human and animal behavior. So they are interested in things like the genome, the structure of the brain, the functionality of the brain. So they also, again, do look at animal models. We have quite a few researchers in our department who study rat physiology to get a better understanding of human physiology and brain function and genomic function as well. So a forensic psychologist works in kind of legal settings or forensic settings. So they do everything from diagnose inmates to evaluate how verifiable eyewitness testimony is. And unfortunately, the sad truth is that eyewitness testimony is not great, and it's very sad how much our legal system relies on it. And this is something we will talk about later as well. But for those who are interested, there is a class here at UF called Legal Psychology, and I recommend it to students who want to learn more. So an industrial organizational psychologist works within a company to kind of evaluate best methodology for maybe improving a company, and it doesn't have to be a company, it can just be any type of industry. For example, I have a friend who she would actually consider herself a developmental psychologist because she studies aging, but she does a lot of industrial organizational work because a lot of her work is about improving hospital settings and hospital care for older patients or for terminally ill patients. And now that I said that, it's actually really good right here to point out that obviously some of these types of psychologists overlap. So I am both a developmental psychologist and I perform experiments. Within our area, we have developmental psychologists who perform experiments, but are examining the biological processes of development. So these different types of psychologists, it's not as clear-cut as the book is making it out to be, but it's good to kind of recognize how much really happens in the field of psychology. So now we'll discuss kind of the great debates of psychology, the first being the big question of nature versus nurture. So what this debate comes down to is that big question of whether our behaviors are attributed mostly to our genes, our nature, or our environment, our nurture. So this question comes down to is whether or not humans are kind of born as a blank slate, and then their environment, their parents, all the stimuli they receive in early infancy, childhood, adulthood, etc., whether or not that entirely shapes or writes the child's future on that blank slate. So that would be that nurture argument. The other question is that we are kind of born genetically predisposed to all of the things that we will be later in life, and that's kind of the nature question. But what we now know, this debate is actually pretty settled because we now know that it's really both. So one consideration for you is the idea of epigenetics, which is that we have genes that are kind of a simplistic way of understanding it is that we have genes that are turned on and off by our environment. So it is both the interaction between our genes and our environment that shape our futures and shape who we are as people. And it's not even always epigenetics. It is all, nature and nurture are constantly working in tandem with one another to shape people. It is both someone's genetics and their environment that work together to shape who they become. So this is not really a debate anymore, but there are some factors that are a little bit maybe more environmental or a little bit more nature. And twin studies are helpful for kind of parsing out these effects. So some qualities are highly heritable, so they're highly tied to our genetics. So something like height is pretty heritable and is not as reliant on our environment as it is on our nature or our genes. But of course, it is still slightly related to environment if, things like diet come into play. And we will talk a lot more about heritability more in depth in the future. So I'm going to post this article. I always think this is interesting. This was a featured piece about some identical brothers who were switched at birth. So these two were identical, but their families, they were switched in the hospital, so it looked like they had two sets of fraternal brothers instead of two sets of identical brothers. This is not a required reading. I always just think it's an interesting article and I highly recommend it. So I will post this article online as well. So now we'll briefly discuss evolutionary psychology because it does have a little bit of a place in the nature versus nurture debate. Evolutionary psychology is a discipline that applies Darwin's theory of natural selection to human and animal behavior. And it rests on the belief that natural selection shaped behavior, and thus many human behaviors once served an adaptive function. Again, remember functionalism and William James. So again, this is tied to the nature versus nurture debate and much more closely on the side of nature in that human behavior was, shaped by our environment in the past and thus has a close link to our genetics. So evolutionary psychology is still popular today because it provides pretty good explanations for human behaviors, but at the end of the day, it's not particularly scientific. And it's not falsifiable. So it provides potential explanations for behavior, but we can't necessarily find fossil records of human behavior, right? We can't find a fossil record of anxiety or the functional adaptations of anxiety. Some of evolutionary psychology compares human and animal models, and that is more promising than potentially looking at archaeology or physical anthropology. But again, even that, we don't share the same genes as other animal species, so even human-animal comparisons are also iffy. So evolutionary psychology is interesting and it is useful and helpful to think of human behavior as adaptive, but again, very iffy science that occurs with evolutionary psychology. The next debate is free will versus determinism, and this asks the big question of to what extent are our behaviors freely selected for versus which ones are determined by environmental influences. So this debate is one that we haven't really solved. So some psychologists believe that free will is an illusion and that thousands of environmental influences decide our behavior in each moment. And a lot of social psychology research lends itself to this belief, and we will talk about some of these strong environmental influences, especially social ones in the social chapter. While others, of course, believe that we make conscious choices to do what we want and that we aren't a product of every environmental stimuli that comes our way. Again, this is a question that is very difficult to answer, and I'm not sure if it is necessarily answerable through science. So now we will discuss our conclusions of today's lectures. First, psychology is a scientific study of the mind, brain, and behavior. We can't understand psychology by focusing only on one level of analysis. Instead, we have to examine all of them, and we have to examine how they interact with one another. Learning to think scientifically teaches us when to trust our common sense and when not to. Learning to think scientifically is an important tool, not just for scientists or intro to psych students like you. It will also help you make better, more informed decisions in your everyday life as well. Again, parsing out that information and critically evaluating the information that is, flooded to you constantly. There's a lot of iffy information out there, and on the internet too. Be thoughtful consumers of the internet. Utilizing the scientific method can help scientists overcome biases. It can also be helpful to utilize those 6 principles of scientific thinking. Another main point from today's lecture is that there are 5 theoretical frameworks that serve as a foundation for modern-day psychology. These include structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, cognitivism, and psychoanalysis. And psychology is a diverse field with many different career opportunities, because we want to sell that to you in case you want to switch over to our wonderful major, or just take more classes with us. We'd love to have you. So thank you for listening today and watching this whole video. I look forward to seeing you for the next lecture.